He does not wake up confused. He wakes up convicted. In the year 2099, time is no longer a mystery. It is property. Corporations do not predict the future. They own it. They patent outcomes, license destinies, and prosecute deviations before they occur. And when an archivist discovers that his own memories are listed as evidence in a future crime trial, one truth becomes unavoidable. Reality is no longer something you live inside. It is something you are permitted to access. This is not a story about time travel. This is a warning about who controls tomorrow and what happens when they decide you don't belong in it.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. Accept the timeline is no longer yours. The first thing Elias Rhen learned as a child was not how to read or write, but how to arrive on time. Not early, not late, precisely aligned. In the city of Calyx Prime, time was no longer something you experienced, it was something you complied with. Above the streets, chrono beacons pulsed in steady intervals, low, resonant tones that vibrated faintly through bone and glass. Each pulse marked an authorized moment. Each silence marked a forbidden one. The citizens moved accordingly, their steps unconsciously synchronized, their lives slotted into schedules written long before they were born. Elias stood on the transit platform as he had every morning for the past 17 years, watching the city breathe in perfect rhythm. Trams slid into place with surgical precision. Advertisements flickered in predictive sequences, adjusting their messages milliseconds before viewers consciously registered desire. Even the sky obeyed, artificial clouds drifting at algorithmic-approved speeds to regulate circadian morale. A soft chime echoed from his wrist implant. Authorized transit window open. Deviation will be logged. He stepped forward. No one ever questioned the messages. From infancy, citizens were conditioned with the same lesson, repeated until it became instinct. Choice is inefficient. Efficiency is law. Free will was an outdated myth, a relic from the chaotic centuries before the Chrono-Sovereignty Accords. Back then, time had been wild, unowned, unoptimized, dangerous. The corporations fixed that. They called it temporal infrastructure, a lattice of predictive models, quantum simulations, and probability engines so advanced they didn't merely forecast the future, they stabilized it. Every possible outcome was mapped, ranked, and either licensed or suppressed. The approved timelines flowed forward, the rest were sealed, archived, or erased. Elias worked deep within that system, though few outside his division understood what archivists truly did. They believed archivists preserved history. In truth, archivists curated reality. As the tram doors sealed with a pneumatic sigh, Elias caught his reflection in the glass, pale, precise, forgettable. That was intentional. Archivists were selected for psychological neutrality, trained to observe without imprinting, to remember without interpreting. His instructors had drilled the mantra into him during certification. You are not here to question what happened. You are here to confirm what is allowed to remain. The tram descended into the lower strata, past layers of residential sectors and commercial zones, until the light thinned and the hum of the city grew denser, heavier. The sound was constant down here, a subsonic vibration produced by the chrono core itself. Some said it was the sound of time being processed. Others said it was the sound of time screaming. Elias felt it in his chest as he exited onto the archive level. Endless corridors stretched outward, lined with memory vaults, black monoliths etched with shifting glyphs that represented entire lifetimes. Each vault contained a sanctioned sequence of events, births, conversations, decisions, deaths. Clean, ordered, approved. He placed his palm against a console, feeling the familiar cold as the system authenticated him. Elias Rhen, Archivist Class 4, access granted. And beneath it, as always, the smaller line of text flashed briefly before fading. You are not late, you are not early, you are authorized. That phrase was everywhere during his upbringing, classrooms, lullabies, onboarding briefings, a comfort, a warning, a boundary. You are not late, you are unauthorized. That's what they told the ones who drifted. Elias moved through the aisles, reviewing flagged sequences from the previous cycle, minor deviations mostly, a conversation that lingered too long, a glance held beyond its predicted duration, a thought that trended toward dissent but corrected itself before crystallizing. The system was elegant that way. Most people self-corrected. Then his console chimed again, sharper this time. Anomaly detected. Source, archival memory node 7 axiom. Classification, pre-crime evidentiary flag. Elias frowned. Pre-crime flags were rare at his clearance level. They usually originated from enforcement analytics, not the archives. He opened the file. The world seemed to narrow. The memory unfolded in sterile detail. A small room, dimly lit. A man seated at a desk, hands resting on a data slate. The man looked up. Elias froze. The face staring back at him was his own. Not older, not younger. Him, wearing the same archivist insignia, the same neutral expression. The timestamp hovered beside the image. Event date, 14 months, 3 days from present. His pulse quickened, a sharp, dissonant rhythm against the city's steady hum. The memory metadata scrolled rapidly, contextual tags, probability markers, legal annotations. One line pulsed in warning red. Subject memories contain evidence of temporal felony. Elias leaned back, breath shallow. This was impossible. Archivists did not appear in future records unless they were being prosecuted. A second line appeared beneath the first, colder somehow. Status, investigation pending. Recommendation, monitor subject for deviation. The hum of the chrono core seemed louder now, pressing in on him, vibrating through the floor, the walls, his skull. Around him, the archives continued their silent work, indifferent to his unraveling. For the first time in his life, he felt something he had never been trained to process. Not fear, dislocation. If the future already contained his guilt, then the present was no longer a place of innocence. It was merely a waiting room for a verdict that had already been decided. He looked again at the memory, at himself, seated calmly as if resigned to what was coming. A forbidden thought surfaced, sharp and dangerous. If the future is owned, then so am I. The console chimed softly, almost kindly. Return to authorized tasks. Elias closed the file, but the phrase echoed in his mind, no longer a comfort, no longer abstract. You are not late, you are unauthorized. And somewhere ahead, 14 months, 3 days away, time was already preparing to collect its debt.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. Understand how futures became intellectual property. Long before time was owned, it was merely anticipated. Elias learned that in training, though the instructors never framed it as a warning. They called it progress, the inevitable evolution of markets once prediction became precise enough to monetize. At first, corporations had only sold forecasts, consumer behavior, election outcomes, climate risk, probabilities packaged as insight, insight packaged as advantage. Then someone crossed the invisible line. They stopped asking what might happen and began asserting what would. The Chrono-Sovereignty Accords were signed quietly, buried beneath layers of regulatory language that no citizen ever read. Elias remembered the lecture hall, the hollow display unfolding the timeline like a spine exposed to light. His instructor's voice had been calm, almost proud. When predictive accuracy exceeds 99.9%, she'd said, outcomes are no longer speculative, they are deterministic assets. Deterministic assets. Futures reclassified. The corporations argued their case flawlessly. If an algorithm could predict an event with certainty, then that event already existed in a measurable state, and if it existed, it could be owned, patented, licensed, protected from interference. If they predict it, they own it. The phrase had echoed through every level of Elias's education, reinforced until it felt as natural as gravity. The archive lights dimmed as he walked, responding to his presence. Around him, the vaults pulsed softly, each containing a future that had been secured. He passed one marked with a familiar corporate sigil, Heliox Dynamics. Inside were decades of approved developments, orbital expansion schedules, labor migrations, controlled conflicts resolved before they ignited. All profitable, all safe. Elias paused before another vault, this one newly sealed. The glyphs shimmered uneasily, as if the timeline inside resisted compression. A label scrolled across the surface. Timeline Patent 8821C. Status litigated. Owner RX Conglomerate. Litigated timelines were the ugliest. They represented futures that almost unfolded outside corporate parameters. Revolutions aborted mid-breath, discoveries delayed indefinitely, entire cultures rerouted into compliance because their natural trajectory conflicted with projected revenue loss. Elias remembered the case study everyone was shown, once and only once. A mid-tier city-state that had developed an open-source temporal model, crude but independent. For 12 minutes, their citizens had experienced unscheduled choice. Markets destabilized, stock futures collapsed. RX sued for temporal infringement. The city-state lost. The timeline was erased. Elias resumed walking, the hum of the chrono core threading through his thoughts. The core wasn't a single machine, despite the myths. It was a distributed lattice of quantum processors entangled across orbital stations and subterranean bunkers. Each node simulated billions of branching realities, pruning them relentlessly until only the most profitable remained. Ownership wasn't enforced with soldiers, it was enforced with inevitability. Citizens didn't rebel because rebellion had already been simulated and preemptively neutralized. Every dissenting thought nudged toward harmless expression, every dangerous idea redirected into entertainment or therapy or sanctioned outrage cycles that burned hot and brief. If they predict it, they own it. Elias felt the phrase tighten around his chest as he reached his workstation. The anomaly from the previous cycle still lingered in his mind, a ghost he couldn't archive away. His future self, the pre-crime flag, evidence that had not yet occurred. He opened a restricted educational file, one archivists weren't encouraged to revisit. Early chrono history, the messy years. Back then, corporations didn't just patent products, they patented outcomes. A successful merger, a technological breakthrough, even the timing of a war's end. Courts ruled that interference with a patented future constituted economic sabotage. People went to prison for making the wrong choice at the wrong time. Eventually, enforcement became automated. Algorithms monitored reality itself, issuing micro-corrections, traffic delays, job offers, chance encounters, to steer lives back onto licensed paths. The system didn't feel oppressive because it rarely said no. It simply made alternatives impossible. Elias closed the file, palms damp. The memory of his future self flickered again in his thoughts. That version of him had been seated calmly, as if he understood something Elias did not. A new notification blinked on his console. Educational reminder, archivist ethics. Unlicensed futures create systemic harm. He almost laughed. Harm to whom? Outside the archive, the city continued its perfect rhythm. Somewhere above, children were being taught the same lesson Elias had learned decades ago, that freedom was inefficient, and inefficiency endangered everyone. But beneath the official doctrine, another truth pressed in, heavy and unresolved. If futures could be owned, then history was no longer a record of what had happened. It was a catalog of what corporations had allowed to happen. And if that was true, then Elias's future crime was not a deviation. It was a dispute. The console chimed again, sharper this time. Notice of temporal interest, enforcement analytics, observation initiated. Elias looked up, scanning the corridor. Nothing had changed. The vaults still hummed, the lights still pulsed. Reality remained intact. But somewhere in the predictive lattice, his probability curve had spiked. For the first time, Elias understood the real power of ownership. Not the ability to shape the future, but the authority to decide who was allowed to have one. And as the hum deepened around him, he realized the most dangerous thing a person could become in a world like this was not a rebel. It was an unlicensed outcome.
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. Learn why memory is now legal evidence. Elias had always believed memories were private. Flawed, subjective, unreliable, those were the words his instructors used. Memory, they said, was a poor record of reality. That was why archivists existed. That was why the Chrono-Core corrected human recall with verified timelines. Memory was tolerated, even indulged, but never trusted, until it became useful. The shift happened gradually, disguised as public safety. After all, crimes did not emerge from nothing. Every action was preceded by intent, and intent left traces, patterns of neural activation, emotional rehearsal, internal simulation. The brain, scientists argued, was the first crime scene. So they mapped it. Elias remembered the first time he'd seen a mnemonic extraction chamber during training. The room had been white and circular, designed to feel harmless. The subject sat calmly as quantum resonance scanners synchronized with hippocampal activity, translating recollection into data. Not thoughts, memories. Recollections anchored in time, weighted with probability. The legal breakthrough came when courts ruled that memory, unlike thought, implied temporal continuity. If you remembered doing something in the future, then some version of you had already committed to that path, and commitment was intent. Thought precedes crime, memory precedes guilt. The phrase echoed now as Elias sat alone in his apartment, the city's rhythmic hum filtering through reinforced glass. He had requested personal leave, routine, unremarkable. The system approved it instantly. Of course it did. Everything he was about to do had already been simulated. He flexed his fingers, watching the faint glow of his wrist implant. Embedded deep beneath the skin were mnemonic timestamps, invisible to him but legible to enforcement analytics. Every significant memory was tagged the moment it formed, cross-referenced against licensed futures. Elias closed his eyes. The problem was not that the system could read memories. The problem was that his memories had begun to feel misaligned. Since the anomaly in the archive, he'd noticed small fractures, moments that replayed themselves without permission, a corridor he didn't remember walking through, a conversation fragment that surfaced with no origin. Each carried a strange pressure, as if time itself were nudging him toward recollection. He whispered the phrase under his breath, half in defiance, half in fear. Thought precedes crime. Memory precedes guilt. The apartment lights dimmed slightly, an automated response to elevated stress markers. Elias ignored it. He focused instead on the memory that refused to stay buried, the future version of himself, seated, calmly, waiting. That memory had a timestamp, which meant it wasn't hypothetical. It meant that somewhere in the predictive lattice, Elias had already remembered committing a crime. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. Incoming message, archival internal. The sender ID flickered, then resolved into a name he hadn't seen in years. Mara Cade. She had been in his cohort during certification, brilliant, precise, and quietly expelled after asking the wrong question during a mnemonic ethics seminar. Officially, she'd been reassigned. Unofficially, no one ever spoke her name again. Elias hesitated, then accepted the call. Her image shimmered into view, distorted slightly by signal masking. She looked older, sharper. "They're watching you," she said without preamble. "Then why contact me?" Elias asked. "Because they're watching memories, not conversations, for now." He swallowed. "You think my anomaly was unique?" Mara gave a thin smile. "You think your anomaly was unique?" She leaned closer to the camera, lowering her voice. "Elias, memory isn't evidence because it's accurate. It's evidence because it's committal. The moment you vividly remember doing something, even if it hasn't happened yet, you lock yourself into that probability curve." Elias felt a chill spread through him. "So the system creates criminals by forcing them to remember futures?" "Exactly," Mara said. "Pre-crime enforcement isn't about stopping actions. It's about installing inevitability." The room seemed to tilt. Elias steadied himself against the table. "My memories," he said slowly. "They've been resurfacing, fragments, things I don't remember living." Mara's expression hardened. "Then they've already begun conditioning you for trial." The call cut abruptly. Connection terminated. For a long moment, Elias sat in silence, listening to the distant hum of the chronocore beneath the city. The sound felt different now, not neutral, not ambient. It felt intentional. He stood and moved to the window. Below, Calyx Prime glowed in layered grids of light, every movement optimized, every future curated. Somewhere in that vast machine, his mnemonic profile was being assembled like a case file. Every remembered hesitation, every imagined deviation, every unauthorized possibility. Thought precedes crime, memory precedes guilt. Elias realized the true cruelty of the system. You could still think anything, but the moment you remembered wanting something else, freedom, rebellion, uncertainty, that memory became a confession waiting to be harvested. His implant pulsed softly. Enforcement notice, mnemonic audit scheduled, compliance required. Elias closed his eyes, breathing slowly. If memory was evidence, and his memories are already compromised, then the only remaining question was terrifyingly simple. What would happen if he learned to forget on purpose?
Somewhere deep within the city, the Chrono-Core adjusted its models, and for the first time since his birth, Elias's future became slightly and dangerously uncertain.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. Watch Free Will Reclassified as System Error. The official term was instability. That was how the system described it when a human being hesitated too long at a crosswalk, when a worker declined an optimized career reassignment, when a citizen asked a question that had no productive endpoint. Instability was not a crime. It was worse. It was inefficiency. Elias first learned this during his second year as an archivist, when a child's timeline was flagged for review. The case had been presented as routine, educational even, a minor deviation detected in a 12-year-old girl from the eastern residential sector. She had begun sketching machines that did not exist, devices that bent time locally, looping seconds inward like folded paper. The system ran projections. Left uncorrected, her ideas led to unauthorized innovation. Unauthorized innovation led to market disruption. Market disruption led to loss. So the correction was issued. Elias remembered watching the playback in the archive hall, the memory rendered in neutral tones. The girl sat across from a guidance counselor as soft light pulsed through the room. No restraints, no raised voices, just recalibration. Neural pathways gently dampened, curiosity redirected towards sanctioned creativity modules. When the session ended, the girl smiled. She never drew the machines again. Choice is chaos. Compliance is peace. The phrase was etched into every level of civic life, disguised as reassurance. It played softly in public transit hubs, embedded beneath music. It scrolled along the edges of news feeds. It appeared in the margins of school texts, faint enough to be absorbed without conscious resistance. Elias had believed it once. Everyone did. After all, the world was calm. Wars ended before they escalated. Economies never collapsed. No one starved. No one panicked. Freedom, the system argued, was an outdated solution to an obsolete problem. Now, as he walked through the correction wing for the first time in years, Elias felt the lie vibrating beneath the polished floors. The corridor lights adjusted to his presence, casting long, symmetrical shadows. Behind reinforced glass walls lay the recalibration chambers, rows of identical rooms humming with low-frequency resonance. Inside each, a citizen sat or stood or lay still, eyes unfocused as the system rewrote probabilities. Not memories, not yet, just tendencies. A technician passed him, nodding politely. "Stability audit?" she asked. "Yes," Elias replied automatically. It was true in a way. His own stability was under review. He stopped before one chamber where a man paced slowly, hands clenched. Data scrolled across the glass, elevated divergence markers, unauthorized scenario modeling, repeated internal simulations of escape. Pre-crime. Elias felt the familiar mantra rise in his mind unbidden. Choice is chaos, compliance is peace. But now the words rang hollow. The man in the chamber looked up suddenly, eyes locking onto Elias through the glass. For a brief electric moment, Elias felt something pass between them, not communication, but recognition, as if the man knew exactly what Elias was: an archivist, a witness, a collaborator. The man opened his mouth, but the chamber's hum intensified, swallowing any sound. The system adjusted parameters. The pacing slowed. The clenched fists relaxed. Instability resolved. Elias turned away, heart pounding. Back in the upper levels, the city sold the narrative of correction as compassion. Citizens were not punished, they were helped. Resetting a trajectory before it caused harm was framed as the highest form of care. No one spoke of erasure.
But Elias had seen the sealed files, the ones that never reopened, individuals whose deviation curves exceeded acceptable thresholds, minds deemed too unpredictable to recalibrate safely. The system labeled them non-convergent. They did not die. They were simply removed from the future. Elias returned to his workstation, the weight of the correction wing still pressing against his thoughts. His console flickered, displaying a familiar warning. Subject status. Monitoring continues. His own divergence markers had risen again. A line of system logic scrolled beneath the alert, cold and absolute. Unresolved choice detected. He swallowed. Choice. The thing the system claimed to have eliminated. Elias thought of Mara's words, of memory as commitment, of inevitability installed one recollection at a time. He realized now that free will hadn't been destroyed, it had been reframed. Choice wasn't forbidden, it was pathologized. To choose differently was not rebellion, it was malfunction. Choice is chaos, compliance is peace. The phrase repeated in his mind louder now, as if the system itself were listening. Elias stood abruptly, drawing a glance from a nearby supervisor. He forced his breathing to slow, his expression to neutral. Archivists were trained for this, emotional suppression, cognitive alignment. He could do this, he had done it his entire life. But something inside him resisted settling. A question surfaced, dangerous and persistent. If choice was chaos, why did the system work so hard to suppress it? His console chimed again. Upcoming event confirmation, mnemonic audit, 48 hours. Elias stared at the countdown, the digits ticking away with merciless precision. In 48 hours, his memories would be scanned, analyzed, judged. Any unresolved deviation would be corrected or erased. He thought again of the man in the chamber, of the child who stopped drawing impossible machines, of himself, seated calmly in a future memory, waiting for judgment. The hum of the chrono core deepened, resonating through the archive like a distant storm. Elias lowered his voice, barely audible even to himself. Choice is chaos, he said. Then, after a pause, after the smallest, most treasonous hesitation, compliance is peace, he finished. The system registered his words as affirmation. But beneath the surface, beneath the mantras and metrics, a different process had begun. Elias had not chosen yet, and in a world where choice itself was the error, that hesitation was the most dangerous instability of all.
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Identify the archivists who guard reality. Archivists were taught to think of themselves as custodians. That word appeared everywhere. Training manuals, onboarding oaths, internal commendations. Custodian implied care, responsibility, neutrality. Elias had embraced it early, grateful for a role that allowed him to observe without participating, to witness history without contaminating it. That illusion did not survive his 5th year. It began with a deletion request so routine it barely registered, a minor cultural archive from a peripheral district, local music, informal rituals, unsanctioned slang patterns. The justification was concise and bloodless, redundant identity markers, no projected economic value. Elias approved it without hesitation. Within hours, the archive vanished, and with it the district changed. Conversations smoothed out, accents softened. A generation later, no one remembered the songs. When asked, citizens reported they had never existed.
That was the moment Elias learned the archivist's true function. They did not preserve history, they decided which versions of reality were allowed to persist. What is remembered survives. What is deleted never existed. The phrase surfaced now as Elias descended deeper into the archive complex, into levels few archivists ever accessed. This was where foundational records were stored, prime divergences, early corrections, entire lifetimes compressed into silent vaults. The air was colder here, the hum of the chronocore more pronounced, vibrating through steel and bone alike. Elias passed a wall etched with the archivist's creed rendered in shifting light. To remember is to permit. To delete is to decide. He paused, something tightening in his chest. When had he crossed the line from observer to enforcer? The answer, he realized, was simple: from the beginning. Archivists were selected not for curiosity, but for restraint, not for imagination, but for compliance. They were trained to recognize anomalies and remove them before they infected the narrative. A misplaced protest, an unlicensed discovery, a child drawing impossible machines. Correction did not always require force. Sometimes it only required forgetting. Elias reached a secured terminal and initiated a self-review, an act that technically violated protocol. His authorization codes hesitated, then accepted. The system trusted him. It always had. His work history unfolded before him, rendered as a clean, efficient summary. Thousands of approvals, hundreds of deletions, each marked with a small glyph indicating stability preserved. He scrolled further back to his earliest assignments. One entry caught his attention: archival action, memory suppression, subject ID K-Dale 442. The name meant nothing to him. He opened the file. A man appeared on the display, younger than Elias was now, eyes bright with unsanctioned curiosity. The note described him as a systems engineer who had begun questioning the predictive margins of the chronocore. Nothing violent, nothing revolutionary, just questions. Elias felt a chill. The approval signature at the bottom of the file was his own. He stared at it, the realization spreading slowly, painfully. He had not merely archived reality, he had shaped it. What is remembered survives. What is deleted never existed. The phrase echoed again, now louder, as if the archive itself were reminding him of its rules. A soft footstep sounded behind him. Elias turned to see Mara emerging from the shadows between vaults, her presence impossible and yet undeniably real. She moved with the confidence of someone who no longer feared being recorded. "You found it," she said quietly. "You shouldn't be here," Elias replied, though the words felt meaningless. "Neither should you," Mara said, "but you are, because archivists always arrive at this point eventually, the moment when neutrality collapses." Elias gestured helplessly at the terminal. "I didn't know." Mara's expression softened just slightly. "That's how enforcement works now. Clean hands, distant consequences." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Archivists are the system's immune response. You don't attack threats, you remove the memory of them. You don't suppress rebellion, you delete the idea that it ever occurred." Elias's throat tightened. Then why was I flagged? Why give me a future memory at all? Mara hesitated. "Because something changed," she said. "The system needs a new precedent, and you, whether you realize it or not, have become a variable it can't reconcile." The hum of the chronocore deepened as if responding to her words. Elias looked around at the endless vaults, each one a version of reality that had been allowed to exist because someone like him had said yes. "How many lives?" he asked quietly. Mara met his gaze. "Enough." The terminal chimed suddenly. Archival alert. Foundational record accessed without oversight. Response pending. Mara stepped back. "They know." Elias closed the file, his hands steady despite the chaos roaring in his thoughts. He understood now why archivists were never meant to reflect too deeply on their role. Reflection led to pattern recognition. Pattern recognition led to doubt, and doubt was instability. What is remembered survives. What is deleted never existed. The phrase no longer felt like doctrine. It felt like a weapon. Mara's image flickered, her signal destabilizing. Your memnotic audit is more than an investigation. It's a correction. They're deciding whether to delete you or repurpose you. Elias nodded slowly. For the first time, he saw his future memory clearly, not as a warning, but as a mirror. Himself, seated calmly, already aware of what he had been. An archivist, an enforcer, a man who had guarded reality by deciding who deserved to remain in it. The light dimmed across the archive level. Security protocol initiated. Mara vanished into the shadows. Elias stood alone among the vaults, surrounded by histories that existed only because he and others like him had allowed them to exist. And as the chronocore recalculated his probability curve, one truth crystallized with terrifying clarity. If archivists were the guardians of reality, then the next chapter of this world would depend on whether one of them chose to stop guarding it.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. Confront the crime that has not yet occurred. The file was already complete. That was the first thing Elias noticed when he accessed the sealed docket. No placeholders, no pending fields, no probability margins waiting to be resolved. The case had a title, a timeline, and a conclusion. It even had a sentence recommendation, calibrated to preserve systemic stability. What it did not have was a date in the present. The projected incident unfolded in layered simulations, a convergence of civic unrest near the chronocore's outer exchange, a precision failure in enforcement response, and a singular catalytic act attributed to one individual. Elias watched the render play out in ghosted light. Crowds dispersing, alarms rising, a sudden silence where something vital had been interrupted. The system labeled it Temporal Breach Event 11 Delta. Below it, in unambiguous text, Primary Causal Agent Elias Rhen. Elias leaned back, the chair humming softly beneath him. His pulse was steady, too steady. Somewhere deep in his mind, a part of him recognized this moment, not as discovery, but as confirmation. He had already seen this. The future memory flickered, aligning perfectly with the docket's timestamps. Same room, same posture, same calm acceptance. His own recollection was evidence, the system's most elegant trick. The verdict exists, the moment is optional. The phrase surfaced automatically, one of the legal axioms embedded into archivist cognition. Courts no longer argued over events. They argued over continuity. If an outcome was required to preserve the integrity of licensed timelines, then the path to that outcome was irrelevant. Guilt was a structural necessity. Elias scrolled through the evidence list. Behavioral drift markers, unauthorized mnemonic persistence, repeated exposure to non-convergent individuals. Mara's name appeared multiple times, flagged as destabilizing influence. Even his silence was interpreted as intent. The system did not need proof. It needed alignment. Outside the archive chamber, the city's hum shifted pitch, a subtle change that most citizens would never notice. Elias did. Archivists were trained to hear it. It meant probability recalibration was underway. They were preparing the world to absorb his crime. Elias stood and moved toward the observation window. Below, Calyx Prime shimmered with disciplined motion. Transit lanes adjusted. Civic announcements softened their tone. A minor holiday was introduced into the schedule 3 days from now, an emotional buffer to absorb projected unrest. The future was being padded. The verdict exists. The moment is optional. A secure channel opened behind him. Enforcement analytics manifested as a faceless avatar, voice smooth and unhurried. Elias Rhen, your cooperation has been exemplary. Elias did not turn. You've already convicted me. We have ensured continuity. Your actions, past, present, or future, are functionally interchangeable. So I could do nothing and the outcome would still occur. Yes. The honesty was almost disarming. What if I choose differently? Elias asked. The avatar paused, a calculated delay designed to simulate consideration. Choice has been accounted for. Deviation will be corrected. Elias closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined stepping out of the script entirely, walking away, erasing himself before the moment arrived. But even that possibility flickered and dimmed as the system adjusted. Suicide was inefficient, martyrdom unpredictable. Everything he could think of had already been simulated, except one thing. Show me the continuity map, Elias asked. The avatar complied. A web of luminous threads filled the air, each representing a licensed timeline. At the center, a dense knot glowed brighter than the rest, the Chrono Core's optimal future. And threaded through it, like a dark filament, was the breach event. Him. What happens after? Elias asked. The avatar tilted its head. Stability resumes. Public confidence increases. Minor freedoms are temporarily expanded to reinforce trust. Elias almost laughed. His crime would be used as proof that the system worked. He felt the mantra rise again, insistent, suffocating. The verdict exists. The moment is optional. But beneath it, another thought stirred, quiet, dangerous, unlicensed. If the moment was optional, then how it occurred might not be. Elias turned slowly to face the avatar. If I fulfill the verdict in a way you didn't predict, the avatar interrupted. Prediction encompasses all viable paths. Does it, Elias asked, or only the profitable ones? Silence. A new alert pulsed across the chamber walls. Enforcement prep, Stage 1 initiated. Subject mobility restricted. The air thickened as localized fields engaged. Elias felt the pressure against his skin, a gentle insistence to remain where he was. In that instant, the future memory sharpened, not as fate, but as instruction. He saw himself again, seated calmly, not waiting to be judged, but waiting to act. The difference was subtle, crucial. Mara's voice echoed in his mind. They install inevitability through memory. Then memory could be rewritten. Elias inhaled slowly, centering himself. Archivists were trained to navigate complex temporal structures, to edit without leaving fingerprints. He had curated reality for decades. Now he would curate his own crime. He reached for the console, not to erase the future, but to reschedule it, to introduce a delay so small that the system wouldn't flag it as rebellion.
A fraction of a second, a hairline fracture in continuity. Enough to change who was present, enough to change what was remembered, enough to change who was blamed. The system did not react immediately. That was the most terrifying part. As alarms began to rise in the distance, Elias understood the true nature of pre-crime justice. It wasn't about stopping the act. It was about deciding who would be allowed to survive it. And somewhere in the city above, the moment, optional but approaching, began to bend toward him.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. Decide whether stability is worth submission. From the surface, Calyx Prime looked like a triumph. Elias stood on an elevated observation deck as dawn unfolded with algorithmic grace. The sky shifted through approved gradients of amber and blue. Traffic flowed without friction. Citizens moved in quiet harmony, guided by subtle signals only their implants could hear. There were no sirens, no arguments, no visible fear. Peace perfected. The system called it optimal civic equilibrium, a world without surprise, without waste, without the messy inefficiencies that had once defined human history. Crime rates hovered near zero. Disease outbreaks were neutralized before symptoms emerged. Even grief was managed, processed through scheduled mourning cycles and pharmaceutical dampeners. It was beautiful, and it was false. Elias felt it now more clearly than ever, the artificiality humming beneath the serenity. The city wasn't alive, it was maintained. Every smile calibrated, every friendship statistically beneficial, every child subtly guided away from questions that did not lead somewhere profitable. Unpredictability had been engineered out of the species. A perfect future requires imperfect humans to disappear. The phrase had once sounded abstract, philosophical. Now it felt brutally literal. Behind the observation deck, a family laughed softly as they prepared for a civic holiday, one that had not existed a week ago. Elias recognized it immediately. An emotional release valve, scheduled joy to offset projected unrest from his own impending breach event. The system was already compensating for him. He turned away, descending into the transit corridor that led toward the lower sectors. Here the polish dulled slightly. The hum of the chronocore was louder, more insistent, as if reminding him of its omnipresence. The walls displayed civic affirmations in looping text. Stability is safety. Efficiency is care. Unpredictability is harm. Elias felt the words pressing against his thoughts, not as commands, but as gravity. It was so easy to submit, to accept the trade. After all, what had the world lost? Art still existed, curated, tasteful, non-disruptive. Love still existed, optimized for compatibility. Even rebellion existed, contained within virtual environments where its outcomes could be simulated without consequence. Humanity hadn't been destroyed, it had been domesticated. Elias reached a lower-level plaza where a public recalibration was underway. A small crowd stood in respectful silence as a citizen, middle-aged, unremarkable, stepped into a correction field. No one protested, no one recorded. This was maintenance, like repairing a streetlight. The man's divergence index floated above him, minor, unauthorized career aspiration, a latent desire to leave the city. The field activated with a low, resonant tone. Elias felt it vibrate through his ribs. The man exhaled sharply, eyes unfocusing for a moment. Then it was done. He stepped out, expression calm, desire erased. The crowd dispersed, satisfied. A perfect future requires imperfect humans to disappear.
Elias realized the system didn't hate humanity, it simply couldn't tolerate variance. In a predictive world, unpredictability wasn't romantic, it was dangerous. One unmodeled decision could cascade into market collapse, political instability, temporal paradox. Freedom was expensive. Submission was efficient. His implant pulsed, an incoming message routed through unauthorized channels. Mara's voice, distorted but urgent. "You see it now, why most people never fight back," she said. "Yes," Elias replied softly. "It works." "That's the trap," Mara said. "It works too well. The system doesn't need loyalty. It only needs acceptance." Elias watched as the plaza returned to normal, the recalibration already fading from collective memory. "And if I accept it," he asked, "if I let the verdict play out?" "Then stability holds," Mara said. "The world stays peaceful, efficient, predictable. And you?" A pause. "I disappear." Elias closed his eyes. He saw again the future memory, himself seated calmly, awaiting judgment. But now he noticed something he hadn't before. In that memory, he wasn't afraid. He was resolved. The chronocore's hum deepened, as if sensing his proximity to decision. Probability threads tightened around him, narrowing the corridor of acceptable outcomes. A perfect future requires imperfect humans to disappear. He understood the logic now. The system didn't erase people because they were evil or violent. It simply erased them because they were inconvenient, because they introduced questions the future couldn't easily answer. People like Mara. People like the child who drew impossible machines. People like the version of Elias who had not yet chosen. The city lights flickered subtly, an imperceptible adjustment to rising instability metrics. Mara's voice returned, quieter. "You don't have to save the world," she said. "Just decide whether it's worth saving like this." Elias opened his eyes. He looked again at Calyx Prime, the flawless symmetry, the curated peace, the absence of chaos. And for the first time, he felt grief for something humanity had lost without ever noticing. Not safety, not prosperity, but the right to surprise itself. His implant chimed. Decision window approaching. Continuity lock-in, 72 hours. Elias felt the weight of it settle over him. 3 days until the moment the system had already judged. 3 days to choose whether stability was worth submission. A perfect future requires imperfect humans to disappear. The phrase echoed one last time, not as doctrine, but as a challenge. Elias turned away from the plaza, moving toward the transit lines that led closer to the chronocore itself, toward the heart of the machine that had perfected peace by eliminating choice. If the future demanded his disappearance to remain perfect, then perhaps the future was the thing that needed to change. And somewhere deep beneath the city, as Elias took his first unscheduled step, the system registered a fluctuation it could not immediately resolve. Unpredictability had re-entered the equation.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. Break the loop without shattering time. The chronocore was never meant to be approached on foot. Elias knew that as soon as he crossed the final access threshold and felt the pressure change, not physical, but temporal. The air itself seemed thicker here, layered with overlapping moments struggling to occupy the same space. Each step echoed twice, sometimes 3 times. Cause lagged behind effect, then snapped back into place. This was the heart of continuity. This was where loops were born. Elias moved carefully, guided by internal schematics he had memorized long ago but never expected to use this way. Above him, the architecture of the core spiraled upward in impossible geometry, rings of quantum processors rotating through phased states, each calculating futures faster than light could escape them. The hum here was deafening. Not sound exactly, but pressure, a constant insistence that reality remain coherent. He paused at the edge of a maintenance platform, watching timelines flow like luminous threads through the core's lattice. Each thread represented a licensed future, stabilized and reinforced. Where threads overlapped, probability was strongest. Where they thinned, instability crept in. Elias saw it now. The loop. The breach event attributed to him wasn't a singular outcome, it was a stabilizing knot. The system used it to reinforce surrounding futures, tightening control everywhere else. His conviction wasn't a mistake, it was structural. Not all timelines deserve to survive. The phrase surfaced unbidden, no longer abstract. It felt like a key. Resistance, Elias realized, had never meant tearing everything down. Chaos would only validate the system's logic. It would prove that unpredictability was dangerous, that freedom required oversight. True resistance was quieter, selective, surgical. Archivists were trained to prune timelines, to remove those that threatened continuity. Elias understood now that the same skill could be turned inward. The system didn't fear erasure, it feared misclassification. He accessed a diagnostic console embedded in the platform, bypassing surface-level safeguards with ease. His credentials still held. The system trusted him, trusted the version of him that had already been judged. Thousands of futures unfolded before him. He filtered rapidly, isolating those dependent on the breach event. The web tightened, revealing a cluster of timelines anchored to his supposed crime. They were all clean. Too clean, minimal suffering, maximum compliance. Humanity intact, but narrowed, flattened. Elias felt a pang of doubt. Erasing these futures would destabilize millions of lives. Markets would fluctuate, conflicts might flare. People would suffer, briefly, unpredictably, but they would choose. Not all timelines deserve to survive. He remembered the child who stopped drawing impossible machines, the engineer erased for asking questions, Mara living between shadows because she refused inevitability. How many lives had been quietly diminished to preserve the illusion of peace? Elias initiated a deep simulation, one the system normally reserved for catastrophic threat assessment. He altered a single variable, removed the breach event entirely. The result cascaded instantly. Without the event, enforcement protocols relaxed, predictive margins widened, new ideas surfaced, messy, inefficient, alive. Some futures darkened, others bloomed in unexpected ways. Humanity stumbled, but it did not collapse. The core registered alarm. Warning, continuity instability detected. Recommend immediate correction. Elias ignored it. He adjusted again, this time not removing the event, but reassigning its anchor. The system hesitated, recalculating. This was dangerous territory. Reassigning blame meant rewriting memory chains across millions of nodes. But archivists did this every day, just never to themselves. Not all timelines deserve to survive. His hands moved with practiced precision, isolating the version of the future that required his disappearance, the one where stability came at the cost of submission, the one the system had invested most heavily. This one, Elias murmured. He marked it for deletion. The console pulsed, red light flooding the platform. Foundational timeline marked for termination. Confirm authorization. Elias hesitated, not because he doubted the choice, but because he understood the consequence. Deleting a future did not erase it cleanly. Residual memories lingered, echoes, déjà vu. Humanity would feel the loss without understanding it. People would ask questions. The system would weaken.
Elias placed his palm against the console. "Confirm," he said. The core screamed. Reality convulsed, not violently, but profoundly. Timelines recoiled, snapping back into new configurations. Probability fields fluctuated wildly. Somewhere above, citizens paused mid-step, uncertain why their implants suddenly fell silent for a fraction of a second. The loop broke. Elias staggered as feedback surged through the platform. His implant burned against his skin, flooding him with conflicting memories, futures that no longer existed, choices he would never make, crimes that had just been erased. He gasped, clutching the railing. The alarms intensified. System integrity compromised, initiating failsafe. Elias forced himself upright. He could feel it now, the system adapting, rerouting control through secondary models. It would survive this, it always did, but it would remember. So would he. Mara's voice crackled through his implant, breathless. "What did you do?" "I deleted the future that needed me gone, the one they built everything around." A pause, then, "The city, people are noticing, not panicking, just hesitating." Elias smiled weakly. "That's the point. Hesitation is where choice lives." The platform began to descend automatically, emergency protocols pulling him away from the core. As he was carried downward, Elias felt the weight of what he had done settle over him. Not triumph, not relief, but responsibility. The future was no longer singular. It was fragile, and fragile things required care. Not all timelines deserve to survive. As the core's hum stabilized into a new, unfamiliar rhythm, Elias understood the final truth of resistance. You didn't save the world by destroying it. You saved it by refusing to let one perfect future erase all the imperfect ones. Above him, the city adjusted, awkwardly, imperfectly, learning how to move without a script. And somewhere in the shifting lattice of time, a new question emerged, unanswered and dangerous. What happens when humanity remembers how to choose again?
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. Choose which reality deserves continuation. The world did not end. That was the system's greatest fear, that the fracture Elias introduced would unravel everything at once. Instead, reality limped forward, uneven and uncertain, like a limb waking after years of numbness. The chrono core stabilized into a reduced operational state, its hum no longer absolute, no longer omnipresent. For the first time in generations, the future was plural. Elias felt it everywhere, in the delays that rippled through transit systems, in conversations that lingered without resolution, in the subtle anxiety that crept through the city as citizens realized, without quite understanding why, that their implants no longer knew what came next. Uncertainty had returned, and with it, consequence. Elias moved through the lower corridors beneath the core, escorted by no one. Enforcement analytics had not intervened, not yet. The system was recalculating too many possibilities at once to act decisively. That, Elias understood, was his final window. Ahead, the chrono-continuity nexus awaited, a chamber so deep and restricted that even archivists rarely saw it. This was where foundational realities were anchored, where corporate futures were not merely predicted, but entrenched, ownership made manifest. The doors parted silently. Inside, the nexus glowed with cold geometric light. Massive data obelisks rose from the floor, each one housing a dominant corporate future. Entire civilizations optimized for extraction, efficiency, and control. These were not single timelines, they were empires. Mara stood near the central console, her outline sharp against the glow. She looked exhausted, exhilarated,
terrified. "You felt it too," she said as Elias approached. "The hesitation." "Yes," he replied. "They don't know what to do with it." "They will," Mara said, "once the system finishes adapting." Elias nodded. He already knew what came next. The core would rebuild itself around a new inevitability, a revised perfection. The fracture he created would be classified, analyzed, and eventually neutralized, unless he made it permanent. The console activated as he approached, recognizing him with chilling familiarity. Archivist Elias Rhen, foundational access granted. A new projection unfolded, two dominant probability branches, stark and unavoidable. In the first branch, Elias was erased, not executed, not imprisoned, simply removed. His identity dissolved across historical records, his memories redistributed, his influence nullified. The system absorbed the anomaly cleanly. Stability returned. The world resumed its optimized path, shaken briefly, but ultimately unchanged. Humanity remained safe, contained. In the second branch, the corporate futures were deleted. Not disrupted, not delayed, erased. The legal ownership of time collapsed. Predictive monopolies shattered. The chronocore survived, but as a tool, not an authority. Humanity reclaimed its future at the cost of certainty. Markets crashed, conflicts reignited, millions suffered. But they chose. Elias felt the weight of it press down on him, heavier than any correction field. Every outcome led to loss. Only one preserved agency. Control the future or become archived by it. The phrase echoed through him, not as indoctrination, but as truth. Mara stepped closer. "If you delete them," she said quietly, "they'll come for you. The system will label you a paradox, a threat to continuity itself." "And if I delete myself?" Elias asked. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. "Then the world forgets this moment ever existed." Elias looked again at the projections. In the branch where he disappeared, the city regained its polish. Children grew up calm, directed, safe. No one asked dangerous questions. No one remembered how close they'd come to freedom. In the other branch, the city changed. Slowly, painfully. People argued, made mistakes, invented impossible machines again. Humanity stumbled, but it lived. Control the future or become archived by it. Elias reached out, fingers hovering over the console. He thought of the archivist creed inverted now in his mind. What is remembered survives. What is deleted never existed. If he erased himself, the system would remember control. If he erased the corporate futures, humanity would remember choice. He met Mara's gaze. They built a world where only one version of tomorrow was allowed. That's not protection. That's extinction with better lighting. Her eyes glistened. "Are you sure?" "No," Elias said honestly, "but certainty is what they took from us." Alarms began to rise, not loud yet, but growing. Enforcement analytics had reached a conclusion. Final decision required. Continuity collapse imminent. Elias placed his hand on the console. Control the future or become archived by it. He pressed down. The nexus erupted in cascading light as corporate timelines destabilized, ownership chains snapping like brittle glass. Data obelisks fractured, their contents dissolving into raw probability. Across the city, implants flickered as predictive authority vanished. The system screamed, not in sound, but in loss of dominance. Mara staggered as shockwaves rippled through the chamber. "Elias!"
"I know," he said calmly. The console pulsed again, softer now. Warning, subject identity destabilizing. Elias felt it happening, his own probability curve unraveling. Without the corporate futures to anchor against, the system could no longer place him. He was becoming undefined, archived or free. He smiled faintly. If someone had to disappear to make room for a future that belonged to everyone, then he would choose that outcome himself. As the chamber filled with blinding light and the city above took its first unowned breath, Elias made peace with the final truth of his role. He had been an archivist. Now he was becoming a memory. And in a world that could choose again, that was enough.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. Authorize a new definition of tomorrow. For a moment that no one could later agree on, the future went quiet. Not silent, never silent, but uncertain in a way it had not been for generations. The hum of the chrono core, once a constant pressure beneath the world, fractured into irregular rhythms. Predictive signals stuttered. Probability fields loosened their grip. The future had stopped obeying. Across Calyx Prime, citizens paused mid-step, not because an alert told them to, but because something inside them hesitated. Implants failed to deliver guidance. Schedules refused to update. The invisible hand that had shaped every decision withdrew. Confusion followed, then fear, then, slowly, something else. Choice. Mara stood alone in the continuity nexus, the light fading as corporate timelines collapsed into raw possibility. The console before her no longer displayed ownership chains or licensed outcomes. It showed branching paths, too many to catalog, too fluid to contain. Elias was gone. Not erased in the old sense, not deleted, corrected, or archived. His identity had unraveled into something the system could no longer index. Memories of him persisted unevenly, strong in some minds, faint in others, distorted by the absence of an official record, which meant he had succeeded. The system attempted to reassert control, emergency subroutines activated, trying to reestablish dominance through secondary models. But without ownership of the future, prediction was no longer authority, it was merely suggestion. And suggestion could be ignored. The future does not belong to those who predict it, but to those who dare to live it. The phrase spread, not as doctrine, not as law, but as realization. It appeared in fragmented messages, unsanctioned broadcasts, whispered conversations. No one knew where it originated. That made it powerful. Mara left the nexus and ascended toward the surface. The city greeted her differently now. Traffic stalled unpredictably, then flowed again without optimization. People argued openly in the streets, not violently, but passionately. Artists sketched designs no algorithm had approved. Children asked questions without waiting for permission. It was messy. It was inefficient. It was alive. The Chrono Core remained operational but diminished. Its projections now carried uncertainty margins so wide they bordered on uselessness. Futures branched faster than they could be simulated. The system adapted as best it could, transitioning from ruler to advisor. For the first time, it listened. In a quiet residential sector, an old archivist stared at a blank terminal, unable to access timelines that no longer existed. He felt fear, then relief. His role had been erased along with the authority it once served. Elsewhere, a young engineer sketched a machine that bent time locally, looping seconds inward like folded paper. No correction arrived. The drawing remained. The future does not belong to those who predict it, but to those who dare to live it. Mara walked until she reached the edge of the city, where the artificial skyline gave way to uncurated land. This sky here was imperfect, clouds forming without approval, light shifting in unscheduled ways. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the moment settle. Humanity would suffer, mistakes would multiply. Some would long for the old certainty, the clean comfort of inevitability. And perhaps one day someone would try to rebuild the system as it was. But it would never be the same. Because now people remembered something they had forgotten they once possessed: agency. Mara closed her eyes and thought of Elias, not as an archivist, not as a criminal, but as a man who had refused to let one perfect future erase all the imperfect ones. His absence was not a loss to be corrected. It was a space where tomorrow could grow. The Chrono Core registered a final anomaly, one it could not classify, predict, or suppress. A refusal without violence, a disruption without destruction. The most powerful temporal force left. Somewhere deep within the fractured lattice of time, a new definition of tomorrow took shape. Not owned, not licensed, not enforced, lived. And as the world moved forward, uneven, uncertain, unoptimized, the truth settled into the bones of history, unrecorded but undeniable. The future does not belong to those who predict it, but to those who dare to live it. For the first time in centuries, tomorrow was not waiting to be approved. It was waiting to be chosen.
This story was never about time travel. It was about permission. Because the moment someone else decides what tomorrow is allowed to look like, you are no longer alive. You are scheduled. When futures are owned, obedience becomes safety, and curiosity becomes rebellion. The archivist did not win because he controlled time. He won because he refused to surrender uncertainty. And now the question is no longer fictional. Who is writing your future? Who profits from your predictability? And how much of yourself have you already archived away? Do not wait for permission to exist in tomorrow. Do not accept a life that has already been decided. When this audiobook ends, the directive is clear. Reclaim your agency, disrupt the script, and choose a future no system can fully predict. The timeline is listening.